Hey guys, what's up? It's Crumb, and welcome to part 4 of things only old RuneScape players will remember. Once again in this one, I want to focus on things that people from like the 2000 to 2004 era will remember. There's so much cool history there, and there's a lot that I talk about in this video, especially pertaining to like PKing and combat, so I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. And as always, let me know what you remember from your early days of RuneScape Classic in the comment section below. I wonder if anyone watching this video remembers the Carpentry skill. If you're like the one person, let me know in the comment section below. So Carpentry was this skill that was meant to come out in RuneScape Classic, and it actually existed on the skill stat window thing before December 12th of 2002. Carpentry came with the promise of player-owned houses. There was this sudden release in Falador and Varrock of all of these little empty houses, and Jagex had the intent of players being able to own them. But then there was this crazy growth and popularity of RuneScape Classic, and they realized, hey, you know what, there's going to be way more players than houses, this isn't feasible. So then they had this secondary idea to kind of increase the community in RuneScape Classic, where they would only allow clans to own a house. But RuneScape grew even more, and that was no longer feasible. Which is really a bit of a shame, because at this time, there was all these other multiplayer games that offered player-owned housing, and RuneScape really didn't have the world size to be able to do that. So with this growth in players and this inability to release these player-owned houses, Carpentry really faded into nothing, and ultimately there's no longer any mention of it anywheres in RuneScape Classic. And on the 12th of December of 2002, with the release of the Agility skill, they completely overrid the Carpentry skill from the stat skill window interface thing. But there is a few reminiscence left in RuneScape Classic till this day. So for example, there's still tiles in the game, which have absolutely no use, and there's planks, which are only ever used in Dragon Slayer, which came out way after the release of Plank, and there's also nails in the game. And so really, this was the precursor to the construction skill, which was released in 2006. And with the release of the construction skill in 2006, they actually introduced player-owned houses, but they fixed this world size issue by making those houses instances, as we know and love them today. I think it would have been really awesome actually to have these player-owned houses in the main cities of RuneScape. Picture walking through Varrock and you would be able to see everybody's house. But of course there just wasn't enough space for that, and it would have been very valuable to have that real estate. I think we've all become very accustomed to how the weapon speed works in Old School and RS3. Different weapons hit at different speeds, and this is almost a must because it balances things out. You wouldn't want the Elder Maul hitting as fast as a Scimitar because it would just be way too overpowered. But in RuneScape Classic, there was no such thing as a weapon speed. Every weapon had at the exact same speed. So this really means that things that you would expect to be meta in RuneScape Classic aren't. An example of this, as long as you are below level 60 attack or you don't have access to dragon weapons, you're going to want to be using a two-hand sword to get the highest damage per second. This is just something that would be complete bonkers if you try to do it in Old School RuneScape. Back in the day, if you were doing like a peer build on RuneScape Classic, that's what you would go with. You would go with a rune two-hand sword or like an adamant two-hand sword, and that would be the best weapon to be PKing within the game. The only time that you would ever want to use a weapon that wasn't two-hand is A, if you had access to dragon weapons, or B, you needed a shield for some reason, like you were killing dragons and need to protect from their fire breath. So before the release of dragon weapons on the 27th of February 2002, the best weapon in the game was the rune two-hand sword. And I just think that that's crazy, that you would see people walking around PKing with those things. Not something that you'd ever see today. The best we get is those free-to-play ranged two-hand swords where that's essentially the spec weapon. So a really cool piece of history here. And you can even see in old pictures people using these two-hand swords. So this one is very fitting because we just talked about attack speed and the rune two-hander. And so way back in the day, before like 2004, RuneScape Classic, peers wanted to use that rune two-hand at the lowest combat level that they could, and thus the wine/beer trick was born. And what this was a way for players to gain attack experience without gaining any hit points experience. So in RuneScape Classic near Varrock, there is these dummies, and you can hit them for 5 experience every time you actually manage to hit them, not every click. But the stipulation is that you had to be below level 8 in your attack to actually hit them. Otherwise, it would just say that you can't gain any more experience from them. But what players could do was drink wine and beer to lower their attack level below 8, and then they could hit them again for experience. And it wasn't bad. It gave 4,380 experience an hour hitting these dummies. And so what players could do is, if you really wanted to, you could be a level 13 walking around with a rune two-hander, which wasn't really too good for PvP because your HP was so low, but it was a cool build. But really where this took place is in the higher level builds. So you could be like a level 28 combat player, but have 4 strength levels on the person you're fighting. However, you would have sacrificed 4 hit points levels. But really, a lot of RuneScape Classic PKers back in the day believed that these 4 strength levels were more beneficial than those 4 hit points levels, so they put a lot of time into doing this wine trick. You know, 4.3k experience doesn't seem like a lot per hour, but you gotta remember the methods for training back then weren't even that good. So it was more experience than training at like Chickens or Draenor, for example. So it really wasn't too bad. And because of that, there quickly became an abundance of these wine pure PKers in RuneScape Classic, and they really took over the scene for a while. We even still see these builds in old school RuneScape today. There's people that build these accounts with really low HP levels to go PKing, and this is really the grandfather of all those PKing builds. And I really wonder if any of you guys had a wine pure way back in the day of RuneScape Classic. I would love to hear about it in the comments below. I wonder how many of you guys actually remember the days of RuneScape where there was no noting system whatsoever. What this meant was, if you had a bulk amount of items you wanted to sell, you had to trade them 12 items at a time because that was the limit of the trade screen. And that made it very, very time consuming for anybody trading a bulk amount of items. And Jagex quickly realized this, so actually fairly early into RuneScape's history, on the 8th of December 2001, they introduced the certificate update, which was a way for players to turn only certain resources into certificates, which were worth 5 of the item, and they were tradable. So it was a very primitive form of the noting system that we have today on RuneScape. And you would convert these raw items into certificates, or most players just called them certs. You would convert them into certs by going to their specific NPC. So there was different NPCs that turned fish, ores, bars, logs, potions, bones, and like limp roots into certificates. And you had to go find them all over different parts of the map, and sometimes they were located quite far away from a bank. So what this meant is you would get your inventory of raw items, you would trudge to the noting NPC, they would note it, and then you would trudge back to the bank and do that over and over again. And then you could sell them as one big stack of certificates. And then the player that bought them would have to repeat that process to unnote them. It was very time consuming, it didn't really fix the problem, in fact it made more work for the players. And it really makes me question, who had the idea to do this instead of just implementing it into the bank system? I don't think that would have been that hard. But nevertheless, it's actually a really cool piece of RuneScape history. And one thing to note here is that they actually expanded on the certificate system, adding more items with the release of pay-to-play. But eventually, of course, in the transition to RuneScape 2, they got rid of the certificate system completely and introduced banknotes, which is just a much, much better idea. So thank you, Jagex Overlords, for introducing the note system. You know, I've played a lot of RuneScape Classic, and it's good nostalgia to go insert some items from time to time. But when you have like 1,000 sharks that you're uncerting or you're certing, it just turns into a huge pain in the arse. Especially when you need to talk to the NPCs and click through those horrible menus every time. You know, I'm really thankful that noting exists. So following along with the combat theme of this video, I want to talk about how much the combat system varied for magic in RuneScape Classic. So in old school, we're used to being able to cast spells, and sometimes those spells will hit, sometimes they won't. But in RuneScape Classic, it was actually possible to fail your spells. This meant you could cast it, and it would actually say failed, not like you hit a 0, it was a real fail. And what would happen is, it wouldn't consume your runes, but you would be unable to cast any spell for 20 seconds. And this was really detrimental in PvP if you think about it. 20 seconds is a long time. And it's true too that if you're trying to teleport out of a dangerous situation using like a Varrock teleport with your runes, if it failed it could really mean your death, especially at a place like KBD. So you had to be much more careful back then when you were using magic. But of course, the higher magic level you got, the less likely you were to actually fail your spells, which was nice. And one more thing, back in RuneScape Classic, there was no such thing as autocasting. So if you were training magic, you would actually have to manually click into your spellbook, then click on your spell, and click on the monster every time you wanted to cast this spell. So really labor intensive to get those levels up. One nice thing I suppose you can say, however, is there was no delay on how fast you could cast those magic spells, and the magic spells back then gave more experience than they do today on, say, old school RuneScape or RS3. So magic was quite a fast skill to actually train, as long as you click fast. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for in this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to let me know, and consider subscribing because I have so many more cool series planned, and I'm definitely going to be releasing more of this type of video. If I missed anything, also let me know. I've been reading all the comments you guys post, and I've learned so much about the RuneScape history just from people that know it that have been leaving comments below, so I really appreciate that. And until next time guys, love, peace, and chicken grease.